Montana Territory, late spring of 1882, the wind peeled across the high plains with a dry bite, and the sun beat down on the dirt road like it was punishing the land for daring to hold on. Henrietta Nash collapsed just past the fork where the coach had left her. Dust clung to her skirts and her bonnet hung limp in her hand. Her lips were cracked, her cheeks raw from the wind. She had walked 4 miles since dawn, hoping to find anyone who would take her in. But the man who had written those sweet letters, who said he wanted a wife and a mother for his 2 young children, had taken one look at her and said, "You're not what I expected," before turning away. She had not cried then. She had stood tall, nodded once, and walked. Now she lay in the road, her limbs heavy, her chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. Her carpetbag was half buried in roadside dust, the last of her water long gone. The wide sky above blurred at the edges. A horse's hooves approached, steady and slow. Henrietta could not lift her head. She only heard the dismount, the sound of boots crunching over gravel. Then the shadow fell across her and a warm, strong hand touched her shoulder. "Miss." The voice was low, rough, like it had not been used much. She blinked up, squinting against the sun. A tall man stood above her, lean and quiet-eyed, his broad frame wrapped in a worn duster. His hat shaded most of his face, but the set of his mouth was firm, his jaw dusted with a few days' growth. He looked like someone who carried his words the same way he carried his rifle, carefully and only when needed. "My name is Henrietta," she whispered, voice dry as paper. "Henrietta Nash." The man crouched beside her, reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a canteen. He held it to her lips without a word. The water was cool and tasted like salvation. "You alone out here?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "The man I came for changed his mind." The cowboy's jaw tensed, but he said nothing. He helped her sit up, then stood and offered his hand. She hesitated, then placed her palm in his. His grip was strong and steady. "I will get you on my horse," he said. "We are about 2 hours out from my place." She looked up at him, dazed. "You live nearby?" He nodded once. "I am Holden Graves." Henrietta let him lift her onto the horse like she weighed nothing. She sagged against the saddle horn, and he climbed up behind her, one arm braced firm around her back to keep her upright as they rode. The prairie rolled out in every direction, wind whispering through the grass. She leaned into the warmth of him, too tired to be afraid. His silence was not cold, it was steady, like the land beneath them. He did not ask questions. He just rode. When they reached his homestead, the sun had dipped low behind the hills. The house was plain but strong, with a barn nearby and a fenced pasture beyond that. Smoke curled from the chimney. A boy and a girl, maybe 7 and 8, ran out onto the porch as they approached. "Papa," the girl called. Henrietta blinked, surprised. Holden helped her down gently. "Tobias, Tessa, this is Miss Henrietta. She will be staying with us for a while." The boy Tobias stood straighter than his years, his freckles dusted across serious cheeks. Tessa clung to her brother's arm, wide-eyed. Henrietta tried to smile. "Hello." Holden guided her into the house and set her gently on a chair near the hearth. The warmth soaked into her bones. The children followed behind, quiet but watching. He knelt in front of her. "You need rest. I will make up the bed." "Tessa, get a blanket." The little girl dashed off, and Tobias brought her a tin cup of water without being asked. Henrietta looked at Holden. "You do not have to keep me. I know I am not your responsibility." He met her eyes for the first time. "You were left in the road." Her throat tightened. "You will stay," he said simply, "until you choose otherwise." That night she slept in a clean bed with the scent of wood smoke and fresh linens around her. She heard the quiet creak of floorboards in the next room, the cowboy moving about, tending to late chores, maybe checking on the children. She stared at the ceiling, her heart heavy and strange. She had come west expecting to be a wife, a mother, a partner. She had not expected to be discarded like a broken wagon wheel. And she had not expected a man like Holden Graves to find her in the dust and offer her a place without question. In the morning, she woke to the smell of coffee and biscuits. Tessa peeked around the doorframe and Henrietta smiled, sitting up. "Papa says you can help me feed the chickens." Henrietta nodded. "I would like that." She stepped outside into the morning light, her skirts brushing the porch. Holden was chopping wood out back, sleeves rolled up, sweat lining his brow. He glanced up as she passed. "Thank you," she said softly. He gave a single nod. That evening, after supper, the children sat on the floor playing a quiet game with buttons and string. Henrietta dried dishes at the basin while Holden handed them to her. Their hands brushed once, and her heart skipped. "You are kind," she said softly. He glanced at her. "No, just decent. You found me when I had nothing left. You had yourself," he said. "That is not nothing." She looked at him, really looked, the way he stood steady, the quiet strength in his eyes. The man who had rejected her had not seen her at all, but Holden, he had not even asked for her story, and still he had opened his home. That night, as she lay in bed, the sound of the wind outside, she felt something settle in her chest. Not quite peace, not yet, but a start, a place to begin again. And when she closed her eyes, she saw him, Holden Graves, silent and strong, the man who had pulled her from the road and given her a place to stand. Henrietta's hands were deep in the feed bin when she felt the shift in air behind her. Tessa had darted off to chase a hen that had refused to stay penned, and Henrietta had stayed behind, brushing grain from her sleeves. Holden stood near the edge of the barn, not speaking, his coat gone and shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, revealing forearms browned by labor and sun. He held a length of rope, freshly braided, the kind used for halter breaking a young colt. "I've a horse needs settling," he said. "Won't take to anyone but me, but she's smart. Might be you could walk her some once she knows your voice." Henrietta nodded, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "I'd like to try." He motioned her to follow, and she did, stepping into the barn's cool shade. The mare stood in a far stall, eyes sharp and wary, flanks twitching with each breath. Henrietta didn't reach for her. Instead, she folded her hands and stood quiet until the mare's ears came forward. "She's like the women in my family," Henrietta murmured. "Doesn't give trust without cause." Holden didn't answer, but she caught the faint sound of his breath shifting, like he might have smiled if he were a man who did that sort of thing. He handed her the lead rope gently. "Don't tug. Just walk, let her come if she will." Henrietta stepped into the stall, heart steady. The mare flinched once, then followed, hooves soft against the hay-strewn floor. Later, as the light thinned into gold, Tobias came to her with a book clutched close. "Papa says you can read. Could you help me with some words?" She sat cross-legged on the porch, letting him lean against her side. His finger traced the words slow and careful, and she guided him through each syllable without rushing. He didn't talk much, but he listened, and when he finally read a sentence on his own, his face lit with something quiet but proud. Holden watched from the fence line, one boot propped against the lower rail, arms folded. When she glanced his way, he looked away. That night she lingered by the stove after the children had gone to bed. The room had gone still, the kind of still that settled deep. Holden sat at the table, oil lamp casting warm light across the grain of the wood. "You've built something solid here," she said. He didn't look up. "Took time. Did it hurt to stay still after riding so long?" His hand curled around the coffee cup. "Some days, but they needed ground under them, and I needed to stop running from ghosts." Henrietta eased into the chair across from him. "I thought I was chasing hope when I boarded that coach. Now I think I was running, too." "You gonna keep running?" She met his eyes. "No, I think I'll stand a while." The air between them shifted, not with anything loud or sudden, but with something quiet and certain. He didn't reach for her. He only nodded once, as if to say, "All right, then." She rose, touching the table's edge with her fingertips. "Good night, Holden." "Henrietta." She paused at the doorway, her name in his mouth, something different than when others spoke it, less a name, more a promise. "You belong here," he said. She didn't answer. Just held his gaze a moment longer, then went to her room and closed the door gently behind her. She lay awake long after the house had gone dark, not from unrest, but from the strange, steady warmth settling in her chest. She had not expected this place. Not this man, not these children, not the quiet days that moved like a river slow but full of depth. She had not expected to feel safe, but she did. And that changed everything. Henrietta folded the last of the linens into the cedar chest by the wall, her sleeves dusted with flour from that morning's baking. Outside, the wind carried the scent of sweet clover, and the barn door creaked faintly on its hinges. A week had passed since Holden found her on the road. She counted it by the number of times Tessa had braided her ribbons into Henrietta's hair, and by the way Tobias had begun to leave his book open on the table, as if waiting for her to sit beside him again. Holden came in late from the west pasture, his boots tracking dry earth across the threshold. He didn't speak, but she noticed the way his shirt clung damp to his back and the fresh tear above his elbow. She crossed the room without a word, fetched water from the basin, and brought the rag to him. He sat on the bench by the window, arms resting on his knees. She knelt beside him and pressed the damp cloth to the scrape, careful and quiet. "Fence down?" she asked. Yearling got spooked, snapped the rail. She dipped the rag again, wrung it out, and touched it lightly to his skin. "You ever think about hiring someone on? Might make it easier." His jaw shifted, but he didn't look away from the window. "I did once. He took off with my seed money come spring." She folded the cloth and laid it in the wash basin. "You should have told me. I could have helped today." "You were helping. The children had clean clothes. Supper was ready before I got in. That counts." Henrietta sat back on her heels. "You speak like someone who's done without." "I have." Neither of them moved for a long moment. The only sound was the ticking of the mantel clock and the soft clatter of a hen scratching near the porch. "You ever think about trying again?" she asked, voice low. He turned his head. "At what?" "Trusting someone." His eyes didn't narrow, but they sharpened in a way that made her feel like she'd stepped too close to a place he kept locked tight. But then he looked down at his hands. "I think about it now," he said. She rose, wiped her palms on her apron, and crossed to the stove. "Tessa asked if she could sleep in my room tonight, said she has dreams sometimes and she doesn't like to be alone. She used to go to her mother for that." His voice was softer now. "She'd crawl in and lay her head on her chest and listen to her breathing until she went back to sleep." Henrietta didn't turn. "She can listen to mine if she wants." Holden stood slowly, walked to the door, and leaned one hand against the jamb. Evening light caught the edge of his profile. "You planning to stay?" he asked. "I don't know yet." She faced him then. "But I'm not planning to go." He nodded once, then stepped out into the yard, the screen door closing behind him with a hollow clap. She stayed where she was, hands resting on the table, the scent of bread still hanging in the air. Through the window, she saw him walk to the corral where the mare she'd started working with stood watching him. He ran a hand down her neck without a word. That night, after Tessa curled into her side and fell asleep with a ribbon clutched in her hand, Henrietta stared at the dark ceiling and thought of Holden's voice, quiet, careful, but no longer closed. She didn't know yet what name to give what was unfolding between them. It wasn't courtship, not exactly. It wasn't charity. It was something slower, something built in the hush between words and the way he let her in without asking anything in return. She'd been claimed, yes, but not with possession, with steadiness, with space to decide for herself. And that, she realized, might be the truest kind of belonging there was. The skies turned slate-colored by late afternoon, the kind of heavy cloud that promised rain without hurry. Henrietta stood in the vegetable plot behind the main house, her palms dark with soil, pushing squash seeds into the earth one by one. The hem of her dress was damp from walking through morning dew, and a curl had escaped her braid to cling against her temple. Holden knelt a few rows over, inspecting the fence rail that bordered the garden. He worked with quiet focus, humming low under his breath something unfamiliar, a sound shaped not for anyone else's ears. "You hum when you're thinking," she said, brushing her hands against her skirt. He didn't look up. "Notice that, did you? It's the only time you make noise without being asked." He glanced at her then, one brow raised. "You don't ask." "I reckon I don't need to." She pressed another seed into the dirt, then sat back on her heels. "Did you always want land?" He leaned against the post he'd just reset. "I wanted stillness. Land seemed the best way to get it." She nodded, not pressing. The silence that followed settled easy between them, filled only by the far-off bawl of a calf and the rustle of dry grass. "Your first wife," she began, careful, "was she from here?" Holden's jaw shifted. "Wyoming territory. Married her in Laramie. She wanted something quieter than mining towns. We came north." Henrietta waited, letting the wind move through the cottonwoods without hurrying him. "She died before the last snow 2 years ago," he said finally. Fever hit hard, I couldn't get her warm. She touched the earth beside her, fingers curling around the coolness. I'm sorry. She was good, he said, kind to everyone. Even when I didn't deserve it. You're not an undeserving man, he didn't answer. Just straightened and dusted off his hands, then offered her his. She let him pull her to her feet, her palm fitting against his like it belonged there. He didn't let go right away. That evening, when the rain finally came, it swept in sudden and hard. Henrietta rushed to gather the laundry from the line while Holden guided the children into the house. Tobias took the pail of clothespins from her without being told, and Tessa clung to Henrietta's skirts, laughing as the wind whipped her braid sideways. Inside, the hearth was already lit. Henrietta hung the damp linens over chairs near the fire. Tessa curled up with a quilt while Tobias pulled out the checkerboard. Holden stood near the window, watching the rain bead down the glass. Henrietta stepped beside him, her shoulder nearly brushing his arm. "Will you teach me what you know about planting?" she asked. "Not just the squash." "All of it," he nodded. "You planning to build something here? I'm not one to borrow soil I don't intend to tend." Holden turned toward her then, the lines around his eyes softer than she'd seen them before. "You want your own rose. I want to grow something that stays." Outside, the rain eased to a hush and the clouds began to drift. Holden reached for her hand again, rough fingers curling around hers with quiet surety. "I've got more land than I can work alone," he said. "Some of it's yours if you want it." Henrietta's throat caught, but she held his gaze. "Then I'll plant it." They stood like that until the fire popped, and Tessa called out something about the bread rising too much. Henrietta laughed and moved to the stove, Holden's hand lingering a moment longer before he let go. They didn't speak of what came next. They didn't need to. It was already growing. Henrietta bent over the ledger at the kitchen table, the oil lamp casting a soft ellipse of light across the page. Ink stained her fingers, and she held the pen with care, calculating the seed orders with a precision learned from running her father's dry goods store back in Missouri. Outside, the wind had quieted, and the only sound was the low creak of the rafters as the house settled in for the night. Holden stepped through the back door, boots lightly dusted, hair damp from the well. He paused in the doorway, watching her in the quiet. "You keep books better than I ever have," he said. Henrietta didn't look up. "You've done well enough to keep this place standing. But if you're planting corn and barley both, you'll need another 10 pounds of seed." He walked over and leaned against the doorframe. "You always this sure of yourself, only when I'm right." He let out a quiet breath that might have been a laugh, and she finally looked up. "I'd like us to keep accounts together," she said. "If I'm staying, it should be as a partner, not a guest." Holden nodded slowly. "That's fair." She set the pen down. "And I'd like to send for a few things, books for the children, some cloth. I can pay for them, I have a little put by." "You don't have to pay," he said. "I know, but I want to contribute what I came with." He stepped closer, pulled out the chair across from her and sat. "You've already given more than you know." She held his gaze, steady and unblinking. "Then we understand each other." He reached across the table, calloused fingers brushing hers. "We do." The next morning, Henrietta found Tessa on the porch with a scrap of muslin clutched in her lap. She was threading a needle with the concentration of someone trying not to breathe too loudly. "I want to make a dress for my doll," Tessa said, "but I don't know how to sew the sleeves." Henrietta knelt beside her. "Show me the doll." Tessa held it out, a corn husk figure with mismatched buttons for eyes. Henrietta turned it over gently in her hands. "We'll shape the shoulders first." "Here, watch." They worked together in the morning light, the girl's small hands growing surer with each stitch. Tobias sat on the stairs nearby with a whittling knife, shaping a piece of pine into what looked like a horse's head. He didn't speak, but when Henrietta glanced over, he gave a short nod that felt more like thanks than anything spoken. Later that week, Holden brought the wagon into town for supplies. Henrietta rode beside him, bonnet tied firm against the wind, her hands folded in her lap. They passed fields just greening with spring shoots, and the mountains rose distant and blue on the horizon. In the mercantile, she handed the list to the clerk and selected ribbon for Tessa and a new blade for Tobias's carving. She found a bolt of calico she liked and 3 books on arithmetic and letters. Holden didn't question any of it, just loaded the parcels into the wagon and waited until she finished. On the ride home, he said, "You miss anything from where you came from?" She thought a moment. "Clean streets." "Church bells, my mother's peach preserves," he nodded. "Not much else." "No," she looked at him. "You," he turned the reins gently, guiding the horse along the rutted road. "I miss riding long distance. I miss the quiet of the high trails. But I wouldn't trade what I've built here." She watched his profile, the way the light touched the edges of his jaw. "I wouldn't either." That night, when the children were asleep and the fire burned low, Henrietta stood at the edge of the porch, arms wrapped around herself. The sky was clear and full of stars. Holden joined her, his footsteps soft on the boards. He didn't speak, just stood beside her until she turned to face him. "I never thought I'd find a place that let me catch my breath," she said. "You caught it here?" he asked. She nodded. "And I want to stay. Not just in the house, with you." Holden didn't move for a long moment. Then he reached out, gently took her hand and brought it to his chest. "Then stay," he said. As my wife, her breath caught, he stepped closer. "I don't offer lightly, but I want a life with you. I want to wake up beside you. I want you to teach Tessa how to sew and Tobias how to read maps. I want to plant barley and corn and whatever else you want to try. With you?" Henrietta's eyes filled, but she didn't look away. "Yes," she said. "I want all those things too. I want you." They married 2 weeks later beneath the cottonwoods behind the barn. Tessa wore a crown of woven wildflowers and Tobias stood tall beside Holden, holding the ring Henrietta had once worn around her neck. The preacher from town came out on a borrowed mule, and the neighbors brought bread and fresh butter and a fiddle that played until the stars were high. Henrietta wore a dress she'd sewn herself, blue as the sky on a clear morning. Holden hadn't shaved, but he'd combed his hair and wore the shirt she'd mended for him, the one with the small patch just under the collar. When the vows were spoken and the ring placed on her finger, Henrietta felt something settle deep like roots finally touching water. That night, when the children were asleep and the fire burned low, she sat beside Holden in the quiet, her head resting against his shoulder, his arm wrapped around her, firm and sure. "I never thought peace would look like this," she said. "It's not peace," he murmured. "It's home." Years later, the house stood stronger than ever, with new fences and a second barn. Tessa grew tall and clever, always with a bit of thread tied to her wrist. Tobias took over the planting, and his maps lined the back wall of the study, carefully inked and dated. Henrietta kept the ledger still, but now Holden's handwriting filled the margins beside hers. They worked side by side, season to season, their days full of purpose and quiet joy. And every evening, without fail, they walked the edge of the pasture together, hand in hand, the sun setting soft behind the hills.